welcome. Today we are going to be doing Puzzle Rush. So, for today's session, I'm thinking of doing uh, slightly different kind of study. So instead of doing like a traditional puzzle rush where I just go through a bunch of positions, chess.com, we'll be doing puzzles, but we'll be doing some harder puzzles, right? So these are the puzzles and exercises, ideally, which grandmasters do for training. The ones you see on chess.com, they are probably good for players around 2000, 2100 ELO rating. But I don't think those kinds of calculation exercises are really good for becoming a stronger player. Like let's say you want to become an IM or a GM. For those cases, for those aspirations, you want to try out some harder calculation problems. So we are going to be doing a few of those. Um, what I would say about these positions is that when you're trying to become like a title player, the calculation exercises assume or there is an understanding that you know about basic endgames, you know about basic techniques. Let's say you're playing rook versus bishop or rook versus knight, or rook and pawn versus bishop. So those kinds of positions, there is an assumption that you know how to win or draw some theoretical positions, right? And so based on that understanding, these calculation sizes are built on top of these understanding. And the first position we're gonna be taking a look at today uh, does just that. So let's just put the position on the board and we'll see what kind of a calculation exercise we are looking at, what kind of a puzzle we are looking at. Now, mind you, since um, these are slightly advanced, they might take some time to really understand what's going on underneath. Right. So I'm setting up the position. Yes. Okay. Suppose you guys are able to see this position now. Yep. This position is white to play. So let's also have that. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that means white's pawns are going towards here, right? And black's pawns are going towards F1. Just want to lay that out in case you have orientation questions. So yeah, this position is white to play, and another aspect of positions like this is that you really don't know what is the objective of the position, right? See, in real tournament games, we have done some calculation exercises or academic puzzles where the objective is given, right? White to play and win, white to play and draw, right? So those kinds of academic exercises we have done, but in practical games, we don't get that hint, right? So let's say you're playing a game, no one is gonna come and whisper into your ear, like saying, "Hey, Akshay, this position is white to play and win. Start calculating." Or this position is white to play and draw. Start calculating. Like that doesn't happen. Whether the position is winning or losing, the objective is also something you have to um, try to guess. Whether you're trying to play for a win or a draw, or do you even have any winning chances? Do you even have any drawing chances in a certain given position? Right. So this is one of those positions. Let's give you guys some time to look at the position, right? So white to play and win. White's knight on its 6 is under attack, and obviously that knight cannot go to a lot of places. It can only go to g4. So there is that, and you have to calculate whether what would happen, let's say after knight g4. Yeah. Um, so let's do that together. My hope is that we can do that together. So yeah, knight g4 check, and let's say after knight g4 check, black can play king f5. I'm going blindfolded deliberately, so that we build some calculation skills here. So I'm deliberately not moving pieces on the board. Okay, so knight g4 check. Um, then black plays king f5, and after king f5, I suppose the only place the knight can go is knight h2. Um, and then black can play something like f into e3. Well, then f into e3, rook g2, and black is attacking both knights. 3 check, king e5, king into h3, and white is doing fine. So that's the first variation we'll calculate. Knight g4 check, king f5, knight h2, f into e3, f into e3, rook g2, knight g3 check, king e5, king into h3, white is doing fine. White can try to win this, but may most likely would be a draw. Since white has two knights. Alright, so we have that variation. Can black improve on? Right, so one big important factor in getting better at chess calculation is to calculate best moves for your opponent. Right? I mean, a lot of players, especially when like amateur players or players whose rating is less than 2300, a lot of them daydream. Right? So daydream about, okay, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna attack his king like this, I'm gonna capture this, but they don't take into account what their opponent is thinking, right? Or what their opponent can do on the chessboard. So doing this kind of one-sided calculation is nothing more than daydreaming, right? And for those of you who are watching this video and also have played in a couple of tournaments, right? So you might uh, like really empathize with the feeling that, hey, I had a winning position but I drew that position, right? Or hey, I had a winning position but I lost, and it's bad luck that I lost, right? This has happened to a lot of us. Or hey, I mean that position was not really losing, it was drawing, but I ended up losing that position. Again, bad luck, right? So we blame um, these kinds of things on bad luck. And though luck is involved, um, it's important to point out that it's more than luck. Like it's about having good calculation skills and making sure that you're always calculating for your opponent's resources. So even in winning positions, your opponent can have some counter-attacking resources, and if you miss them, then yeah, you can end up getting surprised with those uh, nasty counter shots, right? So you end up getting surprised. All right, so we calculated the first variation with knight g4 check and king f5. Let's try to determine or calculate or see if black can do better, if we can improve on black's play. So knight g4 check. Black has this pawn on h3, right? So knight g4 check. Can black take advantage of that pawn on h3? So after knight g4, I'm thinking black can take rook into g4, king into g4, and h2. And I really don't see a way for white to stop the h2 pawn from queening. So after h2, let's say white plays knight g3, then f into g3, and still the pawn is queening, right? So let's take a look at that. Knight g4, take, and if king into g4, then h2, and there is really no way for white to stop black's pawn from winning. If knight g3, there is f into g3, and black is still winning, right? So rook into g4 should be our primary variation, right? Because that is the best move for black. Instead of king f5, rook into g4 is winning for black, or at least black gets that piece. All right. So let's go back to the starting position and try to think about what white can do. So what we just saw was white's knight is really cannot move anywhere because obviously f7 and g8 are taken away, f5 is taken away, but g4 also doesn't work. And yeah, so g4 also doesn't work. And so this knight cannot really move anywhere. So what are the other choices? What I also see in this position is that black's pawn on h3 is really, really strong, right? So let's say if I calculate a move like knight into f4, then black takes rook into h6, check, and king g3, then h2, and black queens his pawn. So this h3 pawn is also like a big threat here for white. So after calculating the initial variations, I get the sense that white should try to focus his attention on this pawn, right? So, because this is one of the strong points of black, and if you get rid of your enemy's strong point, that invariably improves your position, right? So, having said that, uh, white's calculation variations should try to focus on the h3 pawn. This is the process of chess calculation, right? So, a lot of players or audience has questions for me like how do you get better at calculation, and the thing is being good at calculation does not mean that um, you are able to calculate fast. I mean, though that's a factor in competitive chess. So becoming fast is like a matter of practice. Okay, so the more you practice, the more you become fast. But what is the criteria for even calculating the right variations, right? Or what should I focus on, right? Like how do I know the variations I'm calculating they're right? So that's an even bigger question. And the answer to that is not just practice. I mean, like doing problems will not improve the correctness of your variations. For for verifying that your variations are correct, there are other factors, and this is one of them, right? So try to look at the weaknesses in your own position and the strengths in your opponent's position. So when there are two cases, like on a very broad level, there are two cases when when your position can become better. Either you get rid of weaknesses in your own position, or you get rid of strengths in your opponent's position, right? Chess is a two-player game, so always think in pairs. Always think in pairs, right? Chess is a two-player game. Um, so first of all, during calculations, always think about your opponent's moves, and then qualitatively, like the positional factors, think about the strengths in your opponent's position as well as weaknesses, right? So um, you can win when you exploit your opponent's weakness. So there is that factor also. So enough said. We have a weakness in our position. White has a weakness in terms of the h6 knight, which is bad, and then there is the pawn on h3, which is a strength in white's in black's position. So let's see. Yeah. So let's see how to continue here. So knight into f4 doesn't work. Knight g4. There is rook into g4. Can I just take king into h3 here? So I guess that's one variation we'll have to calculate. So king into h3. What can black do? So king into h3. I suppose black will take rook into h6 check, right? And white will have to king g4. That's pretty much the only move. After king g4, black can play f3. White goes knight g3, attacking the e4 pawn. Then black plays king e5. And now white is threatening to play rook h2 and take the f2 pawn. And I don't see a good way to defend against that. Let's take a look at this. King into h3, rook into h6 check, king f3, sorry, king g4. King g4 is the only move. I cannot go to g3. If I go to g2, then there is f3 check, right? And I lose my piece. So I go king g4. The more pawns black exchanges, the better it is for white, right? So because white has a minor piece. So the less number of pawns, the easier it is for white to defend. So let black play f3. And now, where will the knight go? Probably g3, attacking the e4 pawn. Then I play king e5. And here, white only has so many moves. Um, well, actually, black is threatening rook h2 and take this f2 pawn. So let's see if I play something like king g5, then rook h2. I take f2, and yeah, this is already losing, right? So this is already losing for white. So rook h2 is a very powerful threat. One way to stop that is playing knight f1, but then rook h1 will kick out the knight. Let's say knight goes to d2 or g3, doesn't matter, rook f1. Whoops, not rook f1. Uh, that's a blunder. Rook h2. Sorry, rook h2, and we still get the f2 pawn. If king g3, then rook g2 check, king h3, rook into f2, and black is winning. White can take knight into f3. So some of you might have doubts like is two pawns versus rook winning? And yes, it is. It is winning for black. So right, as I said earlier, these high-level problems assume that you know certain techniques and certain theoretical positions, whether they are winning and also how to win them. So yeah, I mean like there is a very standard technique on how to win with a rook against two pawns, two connected pawns. So that kind of textbook knowledge is assumed here. So this is a winning for black. So this is a textbook win for black, and so we can stop our calculations here. All right. So this here after king e5. So let's go back to the position after king e5. Black has a serious threat of rook h2 and rook f2, and uh, we saw few tries of white to stop that. Let's say another one, knight h5. Oops. There is another one, knight h5, but here again black plays rook g6 check, king h3 and rook g2, and again I take the f2 pawn. Again black will take the f2 pawn and black should win here. So seems like king into h3 is also not working. We are taking a strength in black's position, but black gets to attack our weakness, and he's also able to, more importantly, he's able to support his e4 pawn, right? So if we look at this variation closely, king into h3, rook into h6, king g4, f3, knight g3, king e5, black protects his own weakness on e4, and yeah, if e4 is protected, if black can hold on to that e4 pawn, then black should win here. So the observation here I'm making is that if white somehow gets the e4 pawn, right? Let's say this, we remove the e4 pawn from the equation, then f3 falls. Then naturally, if e4 is gone, then f3 falls, and if f3 is gone, then white has drawing chances. So a rook versus knight and two pawns is a textbook draw. Again, there is a textbook method to make a draw out of it. So you should know about it. But that's been my observation so far, right? So what is calculation exercise, right? So and how to become better at calculations. This is the process. So becoming better at calculation means you're calculating different variations in real time and making certain observations, making a note of the key points or the strategical points in the given position. So we went through a couple of variations, right? We went through knight g4, king into h3, and we also covered a couple of sub variations in there. And that has given us some understanding about the position. So the first understanding is that white's knight is, like it's lost. White cannot protect his knight. This knight is going to die eventually. Um, but white has to figure out the best way to keep up that knight, right? So this knight is a goner, but white has to figure out the best way to give that knight, like so that it suits him, so that it gives white a reasonable defense. The second observation is black's pawn on h3 is a pretty strong pawn, so white has to capture it at one point or the other. And the third observation is the more pawns black exchanges, the better the defense for white is. So black will try to play f3, try to keep both the pawns, after which e4 is a weakness, which brings us to the fourth observation is that if white gets the e4 pawn uh, somewhere or the other, then he has a defense. So now a human chess calculation is basically like a cooking recipe, right? So you have these 4 or 5 different factors right now, um, like extracted out of the position by your calculation. So now you have to take a mental note of these factors and try to come up with a variation, like an actual sequence of moves, wherein you can force black to give up the e4 pawn or make other concessions, right? So let's try to calculate. We already covered king into h3. As I said before, that white maybe can try to figure out a better way to give up the knight. So one drawback of king into h3 is that after king into h3, rook into h6, black gets a tempo, right? So rook into h6 is a check, it's a tempo, right? And white has to move his king, and then black gets to play his f1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play knight g4, rook into g4. So I'm going to go back to the knight g4 variation. Knight g4, rook into g4. But instead of taking king into g4, I'm going to play king into h3, right? So h3 is a strength in black's position. So I've given up my knight. That knight was already a goner. But after taking the h3 pawn, I'm attacking the black rook on g4. So notice the difference. The difference between two variations is that after taking the pawn, in this case, white is getting the tempo, not black. After king into h3, rook into h6, black gets a tempo because there is a check. However, after knight g4, rook into g4, king into h3. And now it is white who is getting the tempo because I'm attacking black's rook. So here, if black moves his rook, then I'm going to take knight into f4. Right, so let's say black plays rook g8, knight into f4. Now there is no more pawn on f3, so Um, I don't have to worry about the rook entering and taking on f2. And more importantly, now, like white has a knight and a pawn for a rook, which is a textbook draw in this instance. So now this becomes like a textbook draw after knight into e4 because I've gotten one pawn. So here white is getting drawing chances. So notice how we have come to this variation. Like I didn't come to this variation on the first spot. Chess calculation, as I said, like this is a bit advanced position. And for advanced positions, the most important quality you'll require as a chess player, right? For doing calculations in advanced players is patience. Okay, it's patience that you require. I mean, I can say it's talent and good, like brilliant memory, all those things, but it's not. It's patience because to become a better calculator, to improve your chess calculation in these kinds of advanced positions, you need to calculate a lot. You need to calculate a lot, right? We have we, we have covered about like 7 to 8 variations and including sub variations, right? So after calculating 7 to 8 variations, we are getting some semblance of an idea of what white should do. We are getting some idea about the correct and good moves white should play, right? So we made certain observations at the start. All right. So king into h3, definitely there is a tempo on the black rook. Black rook moves anywhere. It cannot move to g3, g2, g1, and it cannot move, like so. If it moves on the g file, then the pawn on f4 is lost. What if black takes on e3? Well, this is also a draw because I taking into g4, f2, then knight g3. I stop the black pawn from promoting, right? And so I'm stopping it, and yeah. So white should also get a draw. Yeah. Taking f into e3, like black is saying, okay, I'll give up the rook and try to promote a pawn. That doesn't work. However, there is another variation which is f3. And now the point is if white takes king into g4, then f into e2 and white cannot stop the queen. Right? King into g4, f into e2. This is a deadly and serious threat, and white cannot stop that. So f3 is a good move here. So f3 keeps up the pressure on white's position. Now we made an observation in the previous position, right? Which was, what if I get the e4 pawn, right? So if white gets e4 pawn, again white has a draw. And so white plays knight g3 here. Whoops. Now there are two attacks. There is an attack on the rook, right? And there is attack on the pawn. So black has to defend them both. What will black play? What does black has to play here? If black removes his rook from the fourth rank, there are no squares on the fourth rank where the black rook can move. If he moves it to g8, then I take knight into e4, and let's say king e4, I come back king g3, and already here I'll be, like white is feeling better because again he has taken these two pawns, and f3 will fall shortly. So this is again a textbook draw. See, if you have a pawn for exchange, your drawing chances increase, right? So here white is exchanged down, but white does have a pawn for it. So that increases the drawing chances. And in this case, it's a textbook draw. So rook cannot move, but black can play king g5. And now we have a big question here. What should white do? So black has defended his g4 rook and his pawn on e4 as well. So what should white do here? White doesn't have a pawn for the exchange. It's white to play. I guess we have to think on if, see, at this point, there are only two things, right? So either white gets a fortress, right? White gets a fortress so that black cannot penetrate into white's position, or white tries to get some, like, some stalemate, or like go to a king pawn endgame, which is looking very unlikely. So we'll have to think about a fortress, whether, like, whether white can get a fortress here, or how white can get a fortress here. Well, let's say white plays something like king h2. Right. First of all, if white moves his knight, let's say to something like f1, then I go rook g2. Well, in that case, after rook g2, I can come knight g3. So let's suppose it's fine. So if rook g2, then knight g3, if rook f2, then knight e4 check, and black loses his rook, and black cannot really support his e4 pawn. Yeah, so this doesn't look bad for white. So maybe not rook g2, something else. So if I play rook g1, it's the same thing. I can go rook h4 check, so black can go rook h4 check, king g3, and now rook h1. Um, yeah. So if knight h2, I think that's a pretty bad move, because now black has rook g1, king h3, and rook g2, and now black will finally get the f2 pawn. So, and if knight d2 attacking the e4 pawn, still think this is gonna be bad. So we'll go rook g1 check, let's say king h2, rook g2, king h3. So instead of taking on f2, I can play king f5. But I protect e4, and now f2 will fall. So here also black is winning. So let's go back. Yeah, so moving the knight doesn't accomplish as much. If knight h1, then black gives rook h4 check and rook into h1. I'll lose the knight. How about king h2? Well, king h2 seems like now black can go king h4, right? And then I have knight f5 check. I suppose now black can give rook h4 check, king g1, and now king f6. So what I'm trying to do is put the king on e5. Let's say white just waits. Put king on e5. White waits. I yeah. I don't think white has a fortress here, because now rook g4. I'm threatening rook into g3. This pawn endgame is winning for black. Let's say white plays king f1, then rook into g3. This is a winning pawn endgame for black. Um, so because now black can play king f5, king f2, king g4, and this pawn will be lost. So this is losing for white. Let's go back. So king h2, rook h4, king g1, king f6, king f1, king e5. I think once black gets his king to e5, then it's game over for white. Then it's game over for white, because because now e4 is firmly protected, and black has mating threats, right? He can go rook a1, rook h1. He can move his rook around and start giving much more concrete threats. So there is a technically winning plan for black. There is a theoretically a textbook winning plan for black here. So this is looking tough. What shall we do here? Well, what I see is if black gets his king to e5, then black is winning. So can we prevent? So at this point, the real question is, can white prevent the black king from going to e5? That's the $1 million question here. Because if white can prevent that, prevent black from doing that, then yeah, then white has like a draw or like a very strong fortress, I would say. So yeah, I guess like for black's king to come to e5, he will have to like he will have to free his king from the defense of the rook, right? So I guess that's an observation which we can use to our benefit. So first thing for black to go to e5, black has to free his king from the defense of the rook. So now the second question becomes the second level question becomes, can white prevent or can white make the king stay within the g5 g4 zone, right? Can white prevent the black king from freeing up of the defense of g4 rook? I don't like the position of the black king and rook, right? I mean, they have restricted, their mobility is severely restricted. So one observation we make is that if the rook, so this variation tells me knight f1, rook g2, knight g3, that white has a draw here. So if the rook moves from the fourth rank when the black king is on g5, then white has a draw because I just go knight g3, black cannot take rook into f2 because of knight e4, and this is a draw. So I have that observation, and that observation tells me that if the rook moves, then I just come back knight g3. So let's try this move, knight h1, rook h4 check, and white cannot really protect the knight, he has to go king g3. But now if black takes rook into h1, does anybody see what is going on here? Does anybody see what is going on here? It's a stalemate. This is a stalemate, right? This is a legal stalemate. There is no legal move white can make. His pawns do not move and his king cannot move. So this is a stalemate. Very, very interesting. And if the rook goes back to h8, like if the rook moves just to the h file, let's say he goes to h8, it's still a stalemate. It's still a stalemate, right? Because the knight does not have any legal moves, the king cannot move, the pawns cannot move, it's still a stalemate. this is a brilliant discovery, right? So here, instead of going knight f1, I go knight h1. And if black tries to take my rook, sorry, my knight, then I just go king g3. Rook into h1 is a stalemate. Rook h8 is also a stalemate. So knight h1, black cannot play rook h4. So if he goes rook h4, king g3, there is no other move for black. If black goes king h5, it's still a stalemate. What a beauty. White does not have any legal move and his king is not under a check. It's still a stalemate. So literally black is running out of legal moves. He cannot move his rook to anywhere on the h file because it's a stalemate. If he moves his king to h5, it's a stalemate. He cannot move anywhere his king because otherwise his rook on h4 will fall. If he plays king f5, then king into h4, right? Yeah, white will win. So at this point, black is basically running out of any legal moves. The only thing he has is to repeat with rook g4 check. Then okay, I'll come king h3, right? If rook g2, then again come back knight g3. And because I'm controlling this f5 square, this e4 pawn is lost. And this is a draw. This is a draw. Once white gets the e4 pawn, it's a draw. It's a textbook draw. So black cannot play his rook to g2 or g1. He cannot go to h4. You have already seen that. If he goes king f5, then I'll just give a check. If black takes rook into g3, this is a draw. King into g3 is a draw. And if black plays king g5, well, then I go back knight h1. And this is a draw by repetition. So very, very interesting solution to the original problem, right? Very, very interesting solution to the original problem. All right, let's take a look at this position from the top. So we were given this position. White has a bad knight and black has a very strong pawn. And the problem is that white's knight on h6 is really lost. So white has to figure out the best way to give up this knight. If white simply takes king h3, then black gets a tempo and he plays f3 and he gets his king on e5, right? So once black's king is on e5, it's winning for black. So what white does is he plays knight g4 check, and after rook into g4, if he takes king g4, then the pawn moves, and like this pawn will become a queen. But brilliant move, king into h3. Now there are two attacks. There is attack on the g4 rook as well as the f4 pawn, right? So black plays f3, protects his pawn on f4, but now knight g3. The rook is tied down to the defense of the e4 pawn. If black plays king g5, then the brilliant move knight h1. Exclamation. Let me also add a diagram here. And after knight h1, if black goes rook g2, well then I come back knight g3. I get the e4 pawn. It's a draw. And if black goes, and it's the same thing after now rook g. Right? Again knight g3, and I take the e4 pawn. And if black goes rook h4, well then king g3, and any move black plays except rook g4 is a stalemate. So king h5 is a stalemate, rook h8 is a stalemate. If he takes the rook, if he takes the knight, it's still a stalemate. So black has to just keep on repeating with rook g4, king h3. If he goes king f5, tries to move his king, then again knight g3, and again this is a draw by repetition. So with imagination, calculation, a lot of calculation and observation, white gets a draw from the starting position. As you can see, white gets a draw from the starting position. So very, very creative play by white. All right, so I know the pace of like I sort of realized that the pace was very slow, but I'm trying to cater to a wide audience here. So any like there might not be any advanced players on this, like who are watching this, just sort of club players. So I want to be as thorough as I can be, but I do hope you got to learn from this position. I hope you found this particular position and session academic, instructive, educational, as well as entertaining. Right. We are gonna do one more. So let me just save this on my database. Um, and let me start with a new one. Right? So let me put up a new position on the board. The next one, I'm hoping it will be we can go through it a bit faster. Um, yeah. All right. I hope you are able to see this position. All right. So this position is white to play, and I'll just tell what the objective is. This is white to play and win position, right? Um, so obviously here white is an exchange up, but being an exchange up isn't enough. In like there aren't any pawns in the position, so white will get a winning position if he is able to capture one more piece of blacks. Right? So this is a much simpler position than the one we just saw, right? So this is a much simpler and easier position than the previous one. So I hope you guys will like it and we can go through it quickly. So if white gets one of these pieces, then white should win. Right? So then white will win. That's the trick here. Naturally, the first move that comes to mind is rook e2. But if rook e2, then black can play either bishop d4 or bishop a3. Any other move, black would end up rook down. Right. So rook e2. If black plays bishop d4, then white can go knight e6. After knight e6, I'm attacking both the d4 bishop and the knight on a2, and I'm pretty much white will be a rook up, but black can play knight c3. After which white can give a check on h2 and then capture the bishop on d4. So let's take a look at this variation. Rook e2, bishop d4. Because if I take rook into a2, then bishop to c5 would be a draw. This is a theoretical textbook draw. Okay, there is not a lot of mystery here. If you find it's too advanced, I suggest you take a look at some of the other beginner or foundation level material that Unacademy is publishing. All right, so yeah, bishop d4. I can play knight d6, attack. Now both the pieces are attacked, right? The only defensive move for black is knight c3. Oops, knight c3. Because if I take knight into d4, then knight into e2, and again it's a draw. Even though white is a piece of this, a theoretical draw. Not a lot to see here. But knight c3, then I can give a check, and king moves. Knight into d4. White is a rook up. White should win here, right? So white wins in this variation. And as I said earlier, right, good calculation means you have to see good moves for your opponent. You have to see best moves for your opponent. So what we are going to try to do, like or what usually you're supposed to do in good calculation methods is to try to come up with better and better moves for your opponent. If you see something is not working for your opponent, if your opponent is ending up in a bad position, if he's losing in a variation, then you have to. It's on you to come up with a better variation for your opponent. Right? So what we saw here was bishop d4 loses by force. It's a combination. So black loses by force after knight e6. So we are going to try to look at a different move for black, which is bishop a3. The advantage of bishop a3 is that now white's knight cannot attack the black bishop. Right? So that's the major difference here. If now rook into a2, then again bishop to c5, it's the same thing, right? This is again a textbook draw. So bishop a3, and I don't really see how white can win here. Let's say white plays something like knight e4, trying to control the c3 square of the knight. Then I think then I can come to b4. And if rook e3, then bishop c1. Yeah, and black's pieces get untangled. Right? So black's pieces are getting untangled. And this will be a draw. Right? So black's if white does not get one of these pieces, then it's a draw. So let's go back to the starting position. So obviously this particular setup of black pieces is is not good for black, right? So white has an opportunity here to get one of these pieces. We just have to try to come up with a good sequence. So let's see what we can do here. One variation that I can think of is white can give either rook e6 check or rook h4 check, and then go rook h2 or rook e2, right? The advantage of giving a check like this is to displace the opponent's pieces. So that sort of helps. Um, all right, so what I see is rook e6. If now these two squares are highly loaded, right? So these two squares are highly loaded. Because if the black king goes to g7 or g5, then rook e2, same thing, bishop a3. But now the difference is I give a check. I get this intermezzo, and if king f6, then take, and if king into e6, then take, and this is winning for white, right? And the same thing will happen if black's king goes to g5. Again, this is a like this is going to lead to a check. Rook e2, bishop a3. Again, a check, king f6, and it's the same thing on all white wins here. So rook e6 check. The idea is to try to lure black into a loaded square or a loaded rank. I think even h5 is loaded because if king h5, then again rook e2, bishop a3. Now there is no check, but white can take rook into a2, bishop into c5, rook a5. There is a pin on the fifth rank, and this bishop is lost. So white will take the black bishop on c5, and white should win after that. So really, after rook e6 check, um, The only square possible is king h7. King g6 is definitely not possible. So king h7, and yeah, if I give rook e7 check, then black can just come king h6. What else can I play here? And if I play rook e2, well then it's the same thing, bishop a3, and rook into a2, bishop to c5. I don't have anything. So white doesn't have any tactical ideas here to capture one of black's pieces. So rook e6 isn't working. I guess the last try is rook h4. And again, these two squares are loaded, right? So if black comes king g7, then again rook h2. And if bishop d4, well then knight e6 check, and I take the bishop on d4. And if bishop a3, well then I take knight e6 check, king f6. Rook into a2, and this bishop is attacked. And white is a rook up here. So again, king g7 and king g5 are loaded squares. Um, so only square is king g6. I'm thinking there might be something here. There might be some kind of tactic here. I don't see anything special here. Let me go back to the starting position. So maybe the online audience can help me in identifying what's going on, or how white should continue here. Yeah, those checks, they do not seem to be working. Those checks, or even playing a rook e2 directly, does not seem to be helping. So what else can we do? Well, what I'm thinking here is we try to corner these pieces. So let's say I play rook a4. I'm attacking the knight, right? If and black cannot attack my knight. He cannot play bishop a3 or bishop d4. So he has to protect his knight. His knight can go to c3 or c1. I want to consider the worst option, which is c1. On c1, this knight is trapped, right? The knight cannot go to a2. It cannot go to b3 because it's controlled by this knight. This knight also controls the d3 square. So knight cannot go to d3. It cannot go to e2 because it's controlled by the king. So after knight c1, this knight is trapped. So what we can do here is simply bring over the king and attack the bishop on b2. So I guess just white can simply bring his king to grab the black knight, right? So play king e1. This knight isn't going anywhere. Black's bishop can't do anymore anything. If he plays bishop c3, then king d1. If bishop b2, then king c2. And ultimately, black has to leave the protection of the knight or give up the bishop on b2. Right, so king e1, if he plays king g6, well, still king d1, king f6, oops, king f6, and king c2. Black's king is too slow. If black's king were able to come to d5, then things might have changed, but black's king is too far away. So this is winning. So a different take on this, a different take or a different idea to execute in the position. So rook a4, knight c1, and then I simply bring the king. I simply bring the king, and white gets an extra piece on b2. All right, so that seems winning for white after knight c1, but what after knight c3? I don't know. Knight c3, but what I'm seeing here is that now the knight on c3 is severely restricting the black bishop on b2, right? So the black bishop on b2 is temporarily trapped, So I can give a rook a6 check. So my rook on a4 is attacked. So if I can just play knight d3, this bishop on b2 is trapped. So I can give rook a6 check. Let's say it goes something like king g5, knight d3, and this bishop is trapped. Wow, I didn't see that. So I totally stumbled on this solution by accident. So this was a pure chance and accident that I landed on rook a4. But yeah, and now this bishop is trapped. If king d1, then I don't know, like rook king e1, and yeah, black loses his minor piece. So yeah, I mean, like even though it looks like an accident, I did consider a lot of other possibilities, right? So this is what solving puzzles is like, and like it's ultimately solving puzzles is a calculation exercise. I like to use the term calculation exercise because in real tournaments there are like you might be presented with opportunities like this, and if you have gone through these kinds of calculation exercises beforehand, it helps you trigger a response when you're playing an actual game. So during an actual game, these kinds of tactical uh, feelings or intuitions will trigger a response in your brain that you have to start looking for something concrete. um, so even though like I said, we stumbled on rook a4 by accident, but I don't think it was really that big of an accident because we did looked at a lot of variations. We looked at rook e6 check, we looked at rook h4 check, we looked at rook e2. So we did look at a few forcing variations, and the only other alternative was to attack the knight, right? So we cannot attack the bishop from rook b4. So when you're trying to solve puzzles, you have to look for forcing variations, right? So the only other forcing variation that was left after rook e6, rook h4, and rook e2 was rook a4. Like that's the only forcing variation that was left. And yeah, what we see here is that wherever the knight moves, one of the black minor pieces ends up getting trapped. So let's say after rook a4, if black goes knight c1, then the black knight is trapped. If black plays knight c3, then the bishop is trapped, right? He cannot go to a3, cannot go to a1, and after knight d3, he even cannot go to c1. So wherever the knight goes, one minor piece of black gets trapped, and black loses a minor piece, after which white will be a rook up, and white should win the game. All right. I think this was fun. I enjoyed conducting today's session because I think we kind of solved slightly different problems than one would do on chess.com. Um, yeah, and I think these are good examples to explain the calculation process. Thank you for following me today. And